So this is a story that actually runs through an order, and there's millions of these people. It's amazing. And this is what I was told. I was told this story, and I listened to what I was being told, and I found it very fascinating because of the way it was. It turned out that there was, at that time, there was a lot going on, and even though the 12 original Egyptian families, well, there was 8 originally that manifested into 12. They still sort of had control of things, but they were losing control of things big time. They were losing it, and so they needed to devise a way of actually maintaining control. Because the latter part of the Egyptian dynasties, there was this just before the biblical era, there was this massive revolt in Egypt. It was phenomenal. It actually basically destroyed the place, and that's why in the end he ended up into a third world country, as it is now. There was this massive, so they really were having problems containing everything, so they needed a system to come up with, and they lost the intent, and they couldn't get the intent back, and it's all based upon intent. They got it with Akhenaten. Akhenaten gave them the intent they needed, but they had to fool him when he was 13 years old into doing it. But he, in the end, caused a situation in his time that resulted in just over 1,000 years later, Egypt destroyed itself because of the process he'd started off. When it came to the biblical era, Jesus and the families and the elders of the families were trying to come up with a way of containing the situation. They knew they were losing the intent. They couldn't find the one who was going to reset the intent for them, and when they did find him, he refused, point blank. So what they did is they come up with this idea of this book called the Bible, based upon the Book of the Dead, and he asked the elders to give him 12 disciples to follow him around to make out he was this Messiah dude, and he was come to save humanity, to take everyone away. Because what the factions was, it wasn't about paganism. It was a fact that they knew what these buggers were up to. They knew what the church was all about.
But you didn't have the church, and the church didn't exist then.
No, you don't know. Just listen to the story. Right, it did exist, I promise you. There was temples that had all come all the way through from. Church is another word for temple. It's all it is. It's a temple, and this is what the temples existed from the Egyptian times. They just brought it across. None of it had ever. It's all the same stuff. It just gets regurgitated. So anyway, they knew what the church was up to. A bit like sort of people like me know what the church are up to. They had to devise a way of getting people back. So what he decided to do was create this story, but he had a failsafe built into it. And the failsafe was the cross. They needed that cross desperately. And what they did is they devised this story, and Jesus went off and blah, 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 blah. Well, part of his family could see what was going on and didn't like it whatsoever. And he decided he basically cut all his hair off, he donned working man's clothes, and he pissed off. He left. And he went off. This is all going on, and Jesus has got this following. At the same time, there's this bloke who's just going about, he's just working away on building sites or whatever, just doing what he's doing, and he's talking, and people are listening to what he's got to say, and they're actually following him around. And they follow him all the way and all the way and all the way. So anyway, Jesus and the families hear about this, so Jesus decides he's going to don some normal clothes on, and he just disappears and tries to find this man. Well, when he gets there, he finds out it's his own cousin. He can't work it out. So he's gone back to the Romans, who are in the pocket of the families as their own personal army, and said to the Romans, "It's this man, you need to go and arrest him." And they got him anyway, and they brought him back. And just before they said, "We know who you are, you need to do something for us," he refused point blank. He refused to do anything that would help them in any shape, form or fashion. But he says, "I will tell you a prophecy." And he told them a prophecy, and he told them what they were going to do in the next 1,000 years. And because he frightened them so much, they cut his head off. Literally. They were so frightened of him. And his head got stolen, funny enough, and his head was taken. And there was an order where this story comes from. This is where this order tell this story. And they have his head. They have this head. still to this day, this head exists. It was mummified. Egyptian processes were used on it, and it was mummified, and they have this head. It's called Baphomet, the head of Baphomet. Anyway. Yeah. So anyway, so they're devising all these stories. And Jesus at the time had a brother. He had a brother, and his brother, they were very similar. And anyway, there was this, they come up with this idea, and they will literally do anything. They don't matter, they do it to their own families to make things work. There's hundreds and hundreds of evidence of what they will do to their own families just to make things work. So anyway, they devise this idea. They're going to come up with all these miracles to make people believe that this man was this son of this thing they're calling God. And it was all on the myth of the Ten Commandments as well, all the Moses story, which was another myth completely. It was developed to con the people of Egypt at that time. So what they did all this, but there was a threat at the end of it. And the threat was perfect, and it worked exceptionally. And the threat was, if you don't do as we say, you're going to end up like him on that piece of wood. Now do it. And that was the threat. And that's all they needed. And that's why they designed this thing, this cross with a man on it. They did it to his brother, not him. They beat him to a pulp, so he couldn't be recognised. He went on a cross. Obviously, he got put in a cave. 3 days later, Jesus is miraculously walking around. Well, of course he is, because it's his brother who's been done. They devised the feeding of the 5,000 was quite easy to do because everybody had food. So if the food got handed round, it got handed back because everybody had food. All this, and this is an order that talk about this stuff. So I just listen to their stories. And what they did, so they did this, and it worked. They fooled everybody. And they realised that it worked so well that Jesus, all he asked for was to be known throughout history. And he got exactly what he wanted. But it doesn't end there. When he was about 60 years old, he couldn't cope with what he did. He couldn't live with it. And he actually went and owned up. And they killed him for doing it. Because he owned up. He told the truth. A bit like Churchill. When Churchill, just before Churchill died, he wrote his memoirs, which the government conveniently snapped up for about 18 million. Because he told the truth. Loads of people have done this. Just before they're going to meet their end, they tell the truth. It's part of their, I don't know, some form of redemption they feel they have to go through. So they tell the truth. He did exactly the same. And they killed him for it. Because he was telling the truth. He said, look, I helped instigate this. I set this bloody thing up. I know about this. This is false. This is a lie. Do not adhere to this in any shape, form or fashion. And that was the real bit. But what they did is they used all of that. And they used the combination of what he said and what Baphomet said. And that's how they created this element, this facade in the Bible. This is how the religion suddenly got this facade that everyone would adhere to. But the real workings of the religion was corporisation. It was about extracting money from people. And it's always been the same. It's never changed. All the way through. From that period to now, it's exactly the same mechanism going on. No different. It's never changed in all them years. Thousands of years, it's never changed. But the head of Baphomet's the most interesting because that's the head of John the Baptist. And it was John the Baptist, supposedly, who was the one they cut his head off because of what he said to them. Because he told them what was going to happen. He also told them, as well, that on the 1,000-year period in AD, that they would compress and stretch history to suit their needs, which they have done. Because if you actually talk to a lot of people about Egyptian history, and you talk to, like Alan Wilson's a good bloke to talk to, he says that there is 4,100 years, 200 years of Egyptian history, but that's absolute crap, because there's only 2,100 years that's been doubled up to fill in a gap. Because they've created a gap because they took something else away that they don't want anybody. That's why we had things called the Dark Ages. So we don't know what's gone on because there is no history wrote at that time. Well, it was, but it was destroyed, or they deliberately covered it up. So what they did around the period of Magna Carta and King John, that wasn't in 1200, that was in 1000 AD.
So what were the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Well, this is all the stuff that they keep coming up with. I mean, there's the pretense that the Vatican's built on the bones of St Paul. But they're buried in England. And there's people who absolutely 100% stake their lives on that fact, that they're buried in England. There's nothing, and it's funny, if you go to the Vatican and go and ask to have actually look at these things, you're not allowed to. And it's like the epitome of the ego. Everything that the church stands for is the ego. If you go down to Westminster and look at these places, they are the gold and all the splendour and all that. There's people dying in